Well, this is a recording in response to me revising, just a year or two later, 1424 on etiquette.
1424a.
Now, I'm thinking to review some different types of examples. I mean, for instance, I'm a vegetarian. It would so upset me to eat meat that I couldn't abide doing so, and would have to, if you like, forego the company of where I had to eat meat, or it was a great insult if I don't eat what they're offering, say. Now, the best solution in this situation, the harmony, would be for me to avoid such contact, or have such contact where it didn't involve the dilemma. Make sure you're not there at meal times. I mean, very simplistically speaking. In other words, you could say we can meet, but we can't really fellowship together. I can't be there. Now, you might think the issue wouldn't be too troublesome in general in living, but it could be, couldn't it? Supposing I'm relating to a farmer who, he's a livestock farmer as he sees it. His way of life, his whole upbringing has revolved around livestock farming. My very presence becomes an inharmony to him, something he has to cope with or reject. But whether one thinks he should or shouldn't is not the point. What happens if he can't? Or if you like, is not going to cope with this affront, in a sense, to what he identifies with. Being a good man that farms livestock. Knowing full well that if the world was all like Marshall, this would be a major problem for him, to say the least. Now, I think one can respond by saying, yeah, but the world's not all like Marshall, not likely to be a threat really to him in the foreseeable future. He's going to have plenty of fellowship with people that do not have an issue with this. He can probably put up with your presence, but do you see, it'd be very hard for him to have a close fellowship community with you. Massively hard, for instance, if one, consider the situation where you marry such a person. There's great wisdom, isn't there, in the scripture that says, be you not unevenly yoked. It's going to cause tremendous problems if you are. And by unevenly yoked, I mean, I'm not into rural analogies, really. I mean, but presumably, well, for instance, one of the two beasts pulling the cart is much stronger than the other, or wants to go a different way. I'm not sure actually how it's developed, that phrase. Perhaps in pulling a cart or a vehicle, coach, if, for instance, one of the creatures was physically much bigger and taller than the other, Perhaps the whole carriage is now pulled wrongly, and it's very hard to use the carriage as a safe and stable form of vehicle, if you like. Anyway, in a sense, we know what it means. We're clearer on the problem to hand than the actual analogy, I think. Used to be a rule of etiquette in European culture, that, especially English, you never talked about topics that would be political, economic, or religious. The result was, or at least a big danger was therefore, that your conversation wasn't very meaningful because these are the things that were important to you. And if you like, the rule of such principle therefore left your conversation very shallow and relationships shallow. In other words, you avoided conflict, and it had a cost of making people isolated, not loving to each other because they didn't know each other. That was potentially the problem. In other words, it's okay for certain formal occasions, but you can't live on formal occasions. Such problems simply must not be present in some of the relationships you have. So you have close relationships with people who are, if you like, harmonious, not likely to throw up such discordant problems. Probably sayings like birds of a feather flock together. It's a natural consequence of people who are similar. Now, I embrace a very wide variety of people with different beliefs and so forth. I mean, obviously I fellowship with people who are not vegetarian, for instance, but being vegetarian is important to me. But not so important I can't live socially with people who are non-vegetarian. I don't drink, but it's not too big a problem if you are drinking, from my point of view. Although I must admit that if it's having the consequent behaviour that alcohol can cause, I am repelled. In other words, I can't take too much of such company. I mean, equally, people that are what one might term coarse, I find I'm cringing inside. I actually want to get away from such. It conflicts, you see, with my desire to be loving and kind and relating and enjoying their company. Differences tend to make for loneliness, but makes us, of course, appreciative of those that are the same. It's wise then, to some extent, to deliberately avoid certain situations by avoiding certain company. Be aware that you're choosing those that are in harmony with you and separating yourself from those that are not. Of course, those that you separate yourself from, you're going to be less able to bless and help and rescue. Because quite simply, you don't relate to them enough to be significant to them, for them to even hear. An interesting problem is that you might be quite accepting of the difference, but find that they cannot be so accepting. And of course, if you don't realize this, you'll wonder why they are behaving badly to you. Despite your good intention. In some sense, then you're putting too much on them. They're not able to respond right. They're bad back to you. And, well, that causes problems for you. In such circumstances, then, you are not being a blessing to them. And even if you don't, they will in the end repel you from their company. I mean, it's a bit in that phrase, isn't it, in the Jesus story. You know, Jesus says, "Follow me. Those that have ears to hear, let them hear." You know, someone invites him to dinner, they may well find they don't wish to invite him again. It's not that he's not willing to come, but it sounds like there's a simple rule: if you're not invited, don't come, because you may have outstayed your welcome. Now, if on the other hand you have a great need to come, then you'll have to compromise. In other words, you're going to have to come more on their terms than you thought. Are you willing to do that? Because if you're going to not do so, then you're going to get rejected. I'm not saying whether they're right or not to reject you, I'm just saying that's what's going to happen. Therefore, what's the best thing to do? So I find, for instance, certain people in certain churches pressed to get rid of me. Now, I might be a great blessing to certain people in the church, but not to others. If I feel that these difficult others, as I might see it, are asking too much of me, well, if I stay, then I have to recognize the cost. The golden rule seems to be that to live in such a way that those who wish to have your company have access to you, and those that don't have the opportunity of not having to put up with you. And there's a certain advantage or art in making sure you recognize this before your potential enemy does. And you avoid their company in general accordingly. In other words, you have to be very sensitive as to whom you're blessing and whom you're not. There's no point in being in their company if you're not blessing them. It's best to avoid, other things being equal. Now, of course, in work situations, we very often find that we're in the company of a variety of people, some of which are very happy to be with us, and others that are definitely not. We try and find ways in the work situation of avoiding conflict, letting such issues come to a head and be a major concern. we're mindful of how we relate to such people. If we get too relaxed in their company, we find the conflict arises rather fast. So we try to relate to each other what you might call more formally, but in ways that are more acceptable and avoid the issue that upsets. Because some things, not the only way you can avoid is not to be anywhere near them. I mean, if they don't like your appearance, or the way you dress, or your accent, your culture, well, there's not much you can do about it other than not be around them. So we tend to gravitate and move towards the company that's more harmonious. And our society ideally tries to accommodate the variety that it finds it has. But the more variety can mean the more stress. So adults can get tired of the company of the kids all the time. And the kids who are very restricted in the company of the adults all the time. Each needs to experience its own. And we all seek some sort of level of contact with others that is the more harmonious compared to other opportunities that we have. Is loneliness then a consequence of not being able to be in harmony with others much at all? And in a sense, of course, well, it could be. But there may be other factors. You may be isolated for transport reasons. You know, you live in a place where there happens to be no people, and it's very costly to travel far enough to relate to people well. The solution, of course, is to live in a more populous area. But then you may find there are great barriers to the people that are close at hand. And this drives you from their company, even though you're in a populated area. I mean, for argument's sake, you say good morning to people and that's okay, but others don't answer because they're frightened in their society that they might be making contact with someone that's dangerous or potentially so. So they pass and don't look at you and don't say hello. And if you do say hello, that's even a bit disturbing. Even if you're smiling, why is he smiling at me? I don't know. Is he a potential danger? So you can live in a society that has difficulty relating for various reasons. They've all had bad experiences in the past, if you like, given the chaos in the society they're in. And that society might look very functioning, but in fact is very unfriendly, very formal, or very shallow in the way it attempts to have relationships with each other. It may be that you're understood to be very unusual in it, and therefore a potential threat or problem or discord or inharmony, and they simply try to avoid you. In some sense, then, you're in the wrong place, and there may not be a better available to you. So you may remain in the place but withdraw. And that seems to be the problem of modern society, or at least the isolation and loneliness seems to be the problem. But there may be other reasons causing it as well. And one of those might be, as I understand it, the technology that allows one to relocate so often that safe, good relationships are not nurtured. There's not enough time. It's a rolling stone gathers no moss. And you don't stay long enough in a situation to have meaningful relationships. Not because of your unusualness. You might all be much of the same sort of habits and values and culture and so forth. But you're not with each other long enough to have relationships. And therefore, of course, your technology can be a bit of a problem in your society. You keep losing potential built up good relationships behind you as you move on, move jobs, move neighborhoods, move countries and so on. Or a bit like commuter country, which I'm used to being brought up in, where the men, especially we were the workers in those days, would go off to London, 60 miles away, hours travel in each direction sort of thing, and not therefore be relating in their locality at all, not really know their neighbours. They know the people, for instance, at work, but work changes, and work people are not in the vicinity of your home, so they are not being nurtured in a social sense, only in a work sense. And work tends to use people rather than care for people. People are a resource, just as animals become stock. Workers, other people at work become other employees. It's a different sort of situation that you're relating to them in. We have built a world that may not be congenial to being congenial. Friendships, relationships. If you add to that the usual potential variety of differences, of values, and things we like doing, then the separation can become acute. All relationships become threatened in this environment, which seems to be the problem that we're wrestling with in modern societies. Now, it may seem the communal way of life is the answer, but the demands of remaining communal require considerable ability to harmonize differences that were possibly less there in the traditional family, in that the traditional family within itself hadn't many people, it was extended, of very similar background and experience vis-a-vis the culture they were in. Whereas our modern Western world gives us great opportunity to be diverse and varied, which puts further strain on what we might otherwise see as harmonious, ideal relationships. Hey, it occurs to me that if one beast, unevenly yoked thing, it's not that necessarily that you must, change one or other of the two beasts pulling the cart, but rather you must yoke them in such a way that the stronger beast is nearer the center of the pull on the cart or the plough, so that the smaller beast has more leverage, given he's going to be less strong. So you could say the yoke is even if they're both the same height. It's visibly horizontal from where you're looking. Or you could say that, supposing, for instance, the yoke is a bar going across both creatures, and in the middle is a rope that pulls the cart or the plough. If you shift the connection of the rope to the yoke so that it's closer to the stronger beast, you'll find that the smaller beast has more leverage in pull, and therefore you can adjust that link of the rope to the yoke optimally so that the stronger beast is taking more of the effort of pulling without the cart being pulled towards his side of the road. Now, I'm just wondering, is there an analogy is there an equivalent in the analogy that we're using of this not being unequally yoked? Something of it in that you realize that, oh my goodness, he's vegetarian. That could be very important to Marshall. We're going to have to shift more towards him. It's not terribly important to me, I'm a meat eater, but I don't see him every day of the week, do I? I don't mind having a vegetarian meal. All of this, the wife can manage that. We'll have beans on toast. Not a problem. Do you see? We're letting him rule the situation. He's comfortable in that he's not even confronted with possibility of not being vegetarian. And we're all right on it because we don't mind. I mean, this is only 1 or 2 meals when we see him once a month or something, It'd be different if it was day in, day out, Perhaps I like my meat, or I feel, or I must have it or something, or whatever. Do you see you can shift one side may compromise far more than the other. Not because the principle isn't, they don't have a principle that has to be kept. I'm a meat eater, but I don't have to eat meat. It's like saying, well, just because he's a murderer doesn't mean to say he murders everybody. He only murders 1 or 2 people that he really has issue with. Most of the time, he's quite fine to get on with. Well, I mean, that's an extreme. I think I'll leave this conversation. Thank you, Dave.